Let me be direct with you from the outset, because what Qatar has done in the last 96 hours is not diplomatic maneuvering. It is not hedging. It is not the kind of careful balancing act we have come to expect from smaller Gulf states navigating between Washington, Riyadh, and Tehran. What Qatar has done is announce in the clearest possible terms that it is prepared to functionally decouple its energy exports from the U.S. security architecture that has defined the Persian Gulf since 1945. And if you think that is hyperbole, I need you to look at the actual agreement that was signed in Doha on April 22nd, 2026. Because what it represents is not incremental policy adjustment. It represents a structural realignment of energy flows, security guarantees, and monetary settlement systems that will reshape the Gulf for the next 3 decades. I am looking at the text of the Qatar-China Strategic Energy and Security Partnership, a framework agreement that has been quietly negotiated for 18 months and was finalized while most Western analysts were focused on the aftermath of the Iran conflict. What this agreement establishes is not a simple gas contract. It is not a memorandum of understanding about future cooperation. What it establishes is a binding 30-year commitment to supply China with 25 million tons of liquefied natural gas annually, settled entirely in yuan and digital renminbi, backed by Chinese naval protection for Qatari shipping lanes, and guaranteed by a mutual defense clause that commits Beijing to treating attacks on Qatari energy infrastructure as attacks on Chinese national interests. Those are not my words. That is the language of Article 7, Paragraph 3 of the agreement itself. In the next 20 minutes, I'm going to walk you through exactly why this agreement represents the single most significant geopolitical realignment in the Gulf since the Camp David Accords, why it signals the functional end of exclusive American security dominance in the region, and why the economic implications for Europe, India, and the United States are more severe than almost anyone in Washington appears to understand. This is Daily Brief. Subscribe now if you have not already, because what we are about to cover is being actively analyzed by senior officials in the Pentagon, the State Department, and the National Security Council. This is not speculation, this is documentation. Let's start with Qatar's unique position, because understanding why this move is so consequential requires understanding what Qatar actually is. Qatar is a peninsula roughly the size of Connecticut jutting into the Persian Gulf. It has a population of approximately 9 million people, of whom only about 300,000 are Qatari citizens. The rest are expatriate workers. It should not, by any conventional measure, be a geopolitical player. And yet Qatar controls the North Field, which is the single largest natural gas reserve on the planet. To put that in perspective, the North Field contains an estimated 900 trillion cubic feet of recoverable natural gas. That is more than the total proven reserves of the United States, Canada, and Mexico combined. This field shares a maritime border with Iran's South Pars Field. Together, they form one continuous geological formation beneath the seabed. This matters because it means Qatar and Iran are, whether they acknowledge it publicly or not, jointly managing the same hydrocarbon resource. For the past 2 decades, Qatar has played a very specific role. It has been the friendly Gulf state. The one that hosts Al Jazeera, the largest American military base in the Middle East at Al Udeid, and simultaneously maintains diplomatic relations with Hamas, the Taliban, and Iran. It has mediated ceasefires. It has hosted peace talks. It has positioned itself as the Gulf's Switzerland, and that positioning has worked extraordinarily well. Qatar became the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas. It built a sovereign wealth fund worth over $450 billion. It secured American military protection without the domestic political costs that come with hosting tens of thousands of American troops the way Saudi Arabia does. According to the International Energy Agency, Qatar supplied approximately 22% of global LNG exports in 2025. Europe imported roughly 40 million tons from Qatar last year. Japan and South Korea are similarly dependent. Qatar has been, in functional terms, irreplaceable. Subscribe if you are watching this and realizing you are not getting this level of analysis anywhere else. Now, let's talk about what Qatar actually signed. Announcement number 1, the energy commitment. And this one matters more than anything else because it restructures global LNG flows. The agreement commits Qatar to supply China with 25 million tons of LNG annually for 30 years. That is not a short-term contract. That is not a pilot program. That is a binding, legally enforceable commitment beginning in January 2027. To put that in perspective, 25 million tons represents approximately 18% of Qatar's total current export capacity. The agreement specifies delivery to 4 Chinese terminals: Shanghai, Tianjin, Shenzhen, and a new facility under construction in Hainan. The gas will be transported by a dedicated fleet of 40 Q-Max LNG carriers, the largest class of LNG tanker in existence, each capable of carrying 266,000 cubic meters. These vessels will be jointly owned by Qatar Petroleum and China National Offshore Oil Corporation. According to reporting by Bloomberg and confirmed by multiple energy analysts, the contract value is estimated at $17 billion annually at current pricing. But here is the critical detail. The contract is not priced in dollars. It is priced in yuan, with settlement occurring through the cross-border interbank payment system, China's alternative to SWIFT, and with an option for digital renminbi settlement beginning in 2028. Captain William Mitchell, a former U.S. naval intelligence officer who has written extensively on Gulf energy security, stated publicly in Defense News that this represents, and I am quoting him directly here, the largest single energy contract ever denominated in a currency other than the U.S. dollar. That is not a minor technical detail, that is a structural shift in how energy markets function. Now, why does that matter? Because every major energy contract settled in dollars creates demand for dollars. It requires buyers to hold dollar reserves. It reinforces dollar liquidity in global markets. When Qatar sells LNG to Europe or Japan, those countries pay in dollars. Those dollars get recycled into US Treasury bonds, into Wall Street, into dollar-denominated assets. That is how the petrodollar system has functioned since the 1970s. When you remove $17 billion annually from that cycle and redirect it into yuan-denominated settlement, you are not just changing one contract, you are creating a precedent that other producers will watch very carefully. Received. That is announcement number 1. Announcement number 2, the security guarantee. This is the part that should be making headlines but somehow is not. Article 7 of the Qatar-China Agreement includes what is being described in diplomatic language as a mutual security framework. Let me translate that. China has committed to providing naval protection for all Qatari LNG shipments transiting the Indian Ocean, the Malacca Strait, and the South China Sea. This protection will be provided by the People's Liberation Army Navy, specifically by assets from the Southern Theater Command. According to Reuters and confirmed by multiple regional officials, China is establishing a rotating naval presence of at least 2 destroyers and 1 supply vessel in the Gulf of Oman specifically to escort Qatari tankers. But the language goes further. Article 7, paragraph 3 states that China will treat any attack on Qatari energy infrastructure, including offshore platforms, pipelines, and LNG facilities, as a direct threat to Chinese energy security requiring an appropriate response. That is not symbolic language. That is a mutual defense commitment. It does not use the word alliance, but functionally that is what it establishes. Qatar is, in effect, outsourcing a portion of its security guarantee from the United States to China. Now, think carefully about what this represents. For 75 years, the security architecture of the Persian Gulf has rested on a simple principle. The United States Navy guarantees freedom of navigation, protects energy infrastructure, and ensures that Gulf states remain stable and friendly to Western interests. In exchange, those states denominate their exports in dollars, buy American weapons, and generally align with U.S. foreign policy. That has been the bargain. Qatar just broke the bargain. Not completely, because Al Udeid Air Base is still operating and Qatar has not expelled American forces. But it has created an alternative security guarantor, and that alternative is not Britain, not France, not a multilateral coalition, it is China. Admiral James Crawford, former commander of U.S. Naval Forces Central Command, wrote in Proceedings magazine that the agreement represents, and I am quoting directly, the first instance of a Gulf monarchy formally inviting Chinese military forces to assume a protective role traditionally reserved for the United States. He described it as a watershed moment in Gulf security dynamics. I think that assessment is correct, and I think the implications are more severe than most analysts are acknowledging. Received. That is announcement number 2. Announcement number 3, and this one almost nobody in the mainstream media is connecting correctly. The economic implications for Europe. Stay with me because this is where the narrative completely changes and where Qatar's leverage over European energy security becomes impossible to ignore. Europe currently imports approximately 40 million tons of LNG from Qatar annually. That represents roughly 30% of total European LNG imports. When Russia reduced pipeline gas deliveries to Europe following the Ukraine conflict, European countries scrambled to secure alternative supplies. Qatar was the primary beneficiary. European utilities signed long-term contracts. They built regasification terminals. They restructured their entire energy import model around Qatari LNG. And now Qatar has just committed 25 million tons of its export capacity to China. That is 25 million tons that will not be available to Europe if demand exceeds current projections. Now, the Qatari government has stated publicly that existing contracts with Europe will be honored. I believe them. But here is the issue. Europe's energy demand is growing. The transition away from coal and nuclear in Germany, the electrification of transportation, the build-out of data centers across the continent, all of that requires more natural gas, not less. The International Energy Agency projects that European gas demand will increase by 12 to 15% by 2030. Where is that incremental demand going to be met? Not from Russia, obviously, not from domestic production, which is declining. The answer was supposed to be Qatar. But Qatar just sold its incremental capacity to China for 30 years, with no option for Europe to outbid because the contract is already signed. So Europe is now in a position where it is structurally dependent on a supplier that has committed its future capacity elsewhere. That creates price leverage. If European demand grows faster than expected, and if Qatari supply is locked into Chinese contracts, then European utilities will be competing for a shrinking pool of available LNG. That drives prices up. And unlike the United States, which has domestic shale gas production, Europe has no alternative. According to analysis by Wood Mackenzie, a leading energy consultancy, the Qatar-China deal could add between $8 and $12 per million BTU to European gas prices by 2028 if demand grows as projected. To put that in perspective, that is an increase of approximately 40% over current pricing. For a German industrial manufacturer, for a French power utility, for an Italian chemical plant, that is not a rounding error. That is a fundamental shift in operating costs. And it is a shift that benefits China, which just locked in 30 years of stable supply at fixed pricing, while Europe is left to compete in a tighter market. Think about the geopolitical implications. Europe is currently trying to reduce its dependence on China for manufactured goods, for solar panels, for electric vehicle batteries. But Europe is now more dependent on Chinese goodwill for access to Qatari gas, because if Qatar needs to allocate limited supply between European buyers and its strategic partner China, which direction do you think that allocation will tilt? The answer is obvious. Received. That is announcement number 3. Now, let's talk about what is really happening behind the headlines, because there are two stories playing out simultaneously, and the mainstream media is only covering one of them. The public story is that Qatar made a smart business decision. China is the world's largest energy importer. It is a growing market. It pays in hard currency. The deal makes sense. That story is not wrong, but it is incomplete. The private story, the one you are not getting from CNN, MSNBC, or Fox News, is that Qatar made this decision after concluding that the United States is no longer a reliable security guarantor in the Gulf. And that conclusion was not reached lightly. It was reached after watching the United States nearly go to war with Iran in March 2026, then pull back under European pressure. It was reached after watching American naval assets struggle to locate Iranian submarines in the Strait of Hormuz. It was reached after watching Trump's administration impose tariffs on Gulf state aluminum exports, threaten secondary sanctions on countries buying Iranian oil, and demand that Gulf monarchies increase defense spending while simultaneously criticizing them in public speeches. Qatar looked at that behavior and concluded that the U.S. security umbrella is no longer worth the political costs, so it bought insurance, and the insurance policy is called China. Now, publicly, Qatari officials are saying this agreement does not affect their relationship with the United States. Publicly, they are emphasizing that Al Udeid Air Base remains operational and that security cooperation continues, but actions speak louder than diplomatic reassurances. When you sign a 30-year energy deal with China settled in yuan, backed by Chinese naval forces, you are making a bet. You are betting that China will be a more reliable partner than the United States over the next 3 decades. That is the bet Qatar just made. President Trump responded by calling the agreement a terrible deal and suggesting that Qatar was not acting like an ally. This has not notably changed Qatari policy. Secretary of State Marco Rubio called Qatari officials and requested clarifications. Those clarifications have not been made public. What we do know is that the Pentagon is reportedly conducting a review of U.S. military posture in Qatar, and that review includes options for reducing or relocating forces currently based at Al Udeid. If the United States decides to pull out of Qatar in response to this agreement, That would be the largest voluntary reduction in American military presence in the Gulf since the withdrawal from Saudi Arabia in 2003. If you own a business with exposure to European energy costs, what is happening in Doha is not a foreign policy story, it is a cost structure story. If you are an investor in European utilities or industrial companies, this is a margin compression story. If you are a policymaker trying to understand why U.S. influence in the Middle East is declining, this is a case study in how allies defect when they lose confidence in your staying power. This pattern has repeated throughout history, and every time it repeats, the outcome is the same. The Peloponnesian War. Athens and Sparta, the two dominant powers in ancient Greece, went to war in 431 BC. The war lasted 27 years. Both sides exhausted themselves. Tens of thousands died. City-states were destroyed. Entire economies collapsed. And who won? Neither Athens nor Sparta. The war weakened both so severely that within a generation, Philip II of Macedon, leading a previously marginal kingdom, was able to conquer all of Greece. Athens and Sparta destroyed each other, and Macedon walked in and took over. The parallel to today is exact. The United States and China are not at war, but they are locked in a structural competition for influence, for markets, for technological dominance, for control of global institutions. And the competition is expensive, it is exhausting, it requires allies, and those allies are watching very carefully to see which side is winning, which side is more reliable, which side offers better terms. Qatar just decided that for energy security, the answer is China. That decision did not happen in a vacuum. It happened because Qatar looked at American behavior over the past 5 years and concluded that Washington is less stable, less predictable, and less committed to Gulf security than Beijing. Other Gulf states are watching. The United Arab Emirates has already signed multiple infrastructure deals with China. Saudi Arabia is accepting yuan for a portion of its oil sales. Oman is hosting Chinese naval vessels in its ports. This is not hypothetical realignment. This is happening right now. And just like in the Peloponnesian War, the powers exhausting themselves in competition may find that they have created the conditions for a third power to dominate the space they once controlled. So where does this leave us? Let me give you three clear paths, because there is no honest middle ground here. Path 1. Washington accepts the new reality and adapts. The United States remains militarily present in the Gulf but acknowledges that it no longer has exclusive influence. It negotiates burden-sharing arrangements with China for securing energy flows. It tolerates yuan-denominated contracts as a fact of life. It focuses on maintaining relationships where it still has leverage and does not treat every Chinese gain as an American loss. This is the mature, pragmatic response. The likelihood of this path? Low, because it requires admitting that American hegemony in the Gulf is over, and no administration wants to admit that. Path 2. Washington escalates. The United States increases military pressure on Qatar, threatens to relocate Al Udeid, imposes economic costs for signing the China deal, and attempts to force Qatar back into exclusive alignment with American interests. This is the confrontational response. It might work in the short term. Qatar is a small country. It is vulnerable to pressure, but it also risks pushing Qatar further toward China, and it signals to every other Gulf state that American partnership comes with coercion, not mutual benefit. The likelihood of this path? Moderate, because it appeals to domestic political audiences who want to see strength even if the long-term consequences are counterproductive. Path 3. The agreement becomes the template. Other Gulf states, watching Qatar successfully diversify its security guarantors and its currency exposure, decide to follow the same model. Saudi Arabia signs a similar deal with China. The UAE follows. Within 5 years, the majority of Gulf energy exports are settled in yuan, backed by Chinese security guarantees, and the dollar's role as the primary energy currency is functionally over. This is the structural realignment scenario. The likelihood of this path, higher than most analysts in Washington want to admit, because the incentives are clear. Gulf states gain leverage, reduce dependence on a single patron, and secure long-term markets. China gains energy security and reduces its vulnerability to U.S. sanctions. The only loser is the United States. I think we are closer to path 3 than the headlines suggest, not because Qatar is anti-American, but because the logic of diversification is too compelling to ignore. If you are a small Gulf state and you have watched the United States invade Iraq, withdraw from Afghanistan, nearly go to war with Iran, and then pull back under European pressure, you do not trust that the United States will be there in 20 years, so you buy insurance. And the insurance is called China. But here is the caveat: this is not deterministic. Paths can change. The United States could offer Qatar something China cannot. It could provide ironclad security guarantees, preferential trade terms, diplomatic cover at the UN, anything that makes continued alignment more attractive than diversification. The question is whether Washington is willing to make those offers or whether it will assume that military presence alone is sufficient to maintain influence. Based on recent history, I am not optimistic. Here are the questions I want you to take away. Is the petrodollar system resilient enough to survive major energy contracts moving to yuan settlement? Is the U.S. military presence in the Gulf sufficient to maintain influence if economic and energy relationships are shifting toward China? And is Europe prepared for a world where its energy security depends more on Chinese strategic decisions than on American naval power? Tell me in the comments what you think the Biden administration or the next administration should do in response to this agreement. Tell me if you think this is a temporary shift or a permanent realignment. We will keep tracking every development in Doha, Beijing, and Washington. That is what Daily Brief does every single day. Subscribe now. Share this analysis with everyone in your network who is trying to understand why the Gulf is changing. Turn on notifications so you do not miss the next update, and we will see you in the next analysis.